When my parents laughed at my business proposal and told me I was asking them to throw away $80,000, I thought the hardest part would be accepting their rejection. But I never imagined that less than a year later they would stand outside my door, asking me for almost everything I had built. My name is Mara Bennett, and for most of my life I had been the daughter who was expected to understand, compromise, and quietly step aside whenever my younger brother Evan needed something more important, more expensive, or simply more attention than I did. We grew up in a comfortable house outside Charlotte, North Carolina, where family photographs covered the hallway and every holiday looked perfect from the outside. Yet inside those walls, I learned early that Evan's dreams were treated like investments, while mine were treated like hobbies. At 17, when I asked my parents for a modest laptop so I could participate in a regional engineering competition, my father told me that I should learn to work with what I had. But 2 months later, they spent thousands upgrading Evan's car because he wanted to look impressive when applying for college. I stopped asking after that, and instead I became the girl who saved every dollar from weekend jobs, repaired old electronics for neighbors, and taught herself programming from library books while Evan received expensive coaching, private lessons, and family vacations disguised as opportunities. The clearest example came during my final year of school, when I won a statewide technology challenge and returned home carrying a glass trophy, only to find my parents organizing a surprise celebration for Evan because he had been accepted into a private sports academy. So I placed my trophy quietly on the kitchen counter and watched everyone congratulate him. Years later, after earning a scholarship and working through college, I joined a logistics software company in Pittsburgh, where I discovered a problem that thousands of small manufacturers faced every day. Their delivery schedules, inventory updates, and supplier communications were scattered across outdated systems that wasted hours and caused expensive mistakes. Instead of complaining about it like everyone else, I spent 18 months developing a prototype called RouteNest, saved nearly $45,000 from my salary and freelance work, and eventually secured letters of interest from 6 regional companies willing to become early customers if I could build the full platform. That was when I decided to do something I had avoided for years. I went home and asked my parents for help, not because I couldn't find another path, but because a small part of me still wanted to believe that my family might finally look at what I had accomplished and say, "We're proud of you." I presented financial projections, customer commitments, development costs, and a detailed repayment plan at my parents' dining table. But my father barely studied the documents before pushing them back toward me and saying, "Mara, this is exactly the kind of gamble that destroys people who already have a decent life." My mother agreed, warning me that entrepreneurship was unpredictable and insisting that I should keep my secure job instead of risking everything on an idea that might fail. And although their refusal hurt, I thanked them, packed my presentation into my bag, and drove away believing at least their decision had been based on genuine concern. 3 months later, however, I learned that they had quietly guaranteed a $160,000 business loan for Evan, who had decided to open an upscale sports training center despite having no management experience. And suddenly the words, "too risky," sounded less like advice and more like a rule that had only ever applied to me. I didn't confront them, because something inside me had finally stopped begging for their approval. So I used my savings, sold an old investment property I had inherited from my grandmother, and partnered with a former coworker named Priya Shah, who believed in RouteNest enough to join me before we had a real office or a reliable paycheck. We rented 2 desks in the back of a struggling print shop, worked through broken builds, lost sleep over server problems, ate whatever food was cheapest, and slowly turned the prototype into a functioning platform that one small manufacturing company agreed to test. The first year was brutal, and there were nights when I sat alone in our tiny office wondering whether my father had been right, especially after one promising customer canceled its contract and left us scrambling to cover payroll. But then our pilot customer reported that RouteNest had reduced scheduling errors dramatically and asked whether we could expand the software across 3 additional facilities. That single conversation changed everything, because within months referrals began arriving. New contracts followed. Our tiny team grew from 2 people to 9, and the business that my parents had dismissed as a reckless dream finally became profitable enough for me to stop worrying about whether the electricity bill would get paid. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, my mother called after nearly 6 months of barely speaking to me, and instead of asking how the company was doing, she immediately said Evan's training center had failed after a series of unpaid debts. The lender was demanding repayment, and my parents had signed agreements that placed their savings and home at risk. Before I could respond, my father came onto the call and said, "You're doing well now, Mara, and we need $120,000 immediately. You can borrow it against your business, sell your investment property, or find another solution, but you can't just watch your family lose everything." I reminded him that I had once asked for $80,000 to build something with customers waiting, a prototype already working, and a plan to repay every dollar. Yet he had called my idea dangerous while willingly putting 6 figures behind Evan's untested dream. And for the first time, I heard silence on the other end of the phone instead of an argument. My mother eventually whispered, "We thought Evan needed us more." And I answered, "That's exactly what you've taught me my entire life, that I should need less, expect less, and sacrifice more." Days later, my parents and Evan arrived at my office without warning, and when they entered the conference room, they looked completely different from the confident family I remembered because Evan avoided eye contact. My mother looked exhausted, and my father carried a folder containing bank statements and repayment demands, as though placing the papers on my desk could somehow transfer their crisis into my hands. He told me that family was supposed to protect its own, but I opened my old laptop, pulled up the original RouteNest proposal they had rejected, and calmly showed him the date, the customer letters, the financial plan, and the notes I had written after their refusal. Then I said, "You weren't protecting me when I needed help. You were protecting your belief that Evan deserved to be rescued, and I deserved to survive." My father accused me of holding a grudge, but I told him this wasn't about revenge, and I wasn't going to celebrate their suffering, because I simply refused to destroy the life I had built to rescue people who had repeatedly chosen someone else's future over mine. And after years of swallowing my feelings, I finally understood that saying no didn't make me cruel. I offered to help them find a financial counselor and negotiate a manageable repayment arrangement, but I would not give them the money they demanded. And when Evan angrily called me selfish, I looked at him and said, "You don't need another person to save you. You need the chance to take responsibility for what happened." They left without another word, and although closing that door felt strangely painful, the silence afterward was different from the loneliness I had known growing up, because for once I wasn't waiting for someone to approve of my decision or wondering whether I had done enough to earn my place in my own family. Over the next year, RouteNest expanded into several states. Priya became my business partner. We moved into a modern office overlooking the river, and I began mentoring young entrepreneurs who reminded me of the person I had once been, the person with an idea, a plan, and just enough courage to keep going even when nobody around her believed. Eventually, I learned that my parents had sold their house and moved into a smaller place, while Evan had taken a regular job and slowly started paying down his debts. And although our relationship never returned to what it had been, I stopped waiting for an apology because healing became easier when I realized I didn't need them to admit they had been wrong in order for my experience to be real. I still keep that first RouteNest proposal in a drawer beside my desk, not as proof that I defeated my family, but as a reminder of the night I finally stopped measuring my worth by who was willing to invest in me, because sometimes the person who believes in your future has to be you. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.